Today's lesson is all about water insecurity. So if we remember from last lesson, we looked at what water insecurity or water scarcity is. And today we're going to be answering a really, really important question. Now, with water security becoming more and more of an issue in the future, which is something we are worried about across the world, we need to understand the impacts of this. So we need to think about what it is we're worried is going to happen if people or when people in certain parts of the world inevitably don't have access to a clean, safe, and continuous water supply. So that's where we're going with today's lesson. As I said on the last video, I'm going to talk you through different parts of the lesson. I'm going to give you some information that goes alongside the task sheet and the PowerPoint to help you fill in your work booklet and hopefully help you understand the lesson a bit better. Now, at any point, please do pause it. I will talk you through the tasks and then you can pause it, complete the task before moving on. Equally, you can just rewind the video and rewatch different parts of it as many times as you need to hopefully help you have a good understanding of this part of the topic before we then move on next week. So, to start off with, at the top of the PowerPoint, there's a video which links to the USA and just sets the scene. It's a really good example. It's an example which is perhaps quite strange because we normally think of water insecurity and water scarcity as a problem which affects low-income countries and newly emerging economies. But with the Colorado River, the issues of demand versus supply are causing a real problem in the western part of the USA. So do watch that just to set the scene and listen out for some of the issues before we then get started on the main part of the lesson. Now, to start off with, I want you to look at these pictures and I want you to think about that question that I'm posing at the top of the slide. Would you drink this water? Or would you want to drink this water? Because we're quite fortunate in the UK. We're a high-income country. We have a relatively stable, clean, safe water supply that we take for granted. But that's not the case all the world around. There's 7.7 billion people on planet Earth, and dirty water kills more people every year than all forms of violence, including war. So why is that? Now, I certainly look at that and think that's not fair. We should do something about that. And we're going to come on to that in the next few lessons. But for today, we're just thinking about this issue of water insecurity, and we're looking at what the impacts are on people, on the countries and the communities they live in, and on the environment around them. So to start off with, we need to think about where in the world this is a particular problem. And in your work booklet, you've got two tasks and a map, which there's a colour version of on the screen here. Now, it's a funny map. It's called a topological map. It's not a normal map as people would sort of expect to see. But as it says on the slide there, the country size or the territory size is proportional. So in other words, the bigger the size of the country, the more of something, whereas the smaller the country, the less of something. And if you look at the key here, the proportion, the size of the country shows the proportion of people that live there without access to a clean, safe, reliable water supply. So the bigger countries on this map are the countries that are suffering with this problem of water insecurity, and the smaller countries are countries that don't have a problem. You can see the top middle there's the UK. We're quite small. We're smaller than we'd normally expect to see ourselves on a map, which proves that we're not a country that suffers with this problem. But your first task is to describe the distribution or the pattern of countries that do have poor water quality. And you can start by trying to identify continents or countries you might know. And I think when I look at this, I see two main areas of the map where there's a problem. One of them is in the middle, and that there is the continent of Africa. But I don't want you to fall into the trap of just writing Africa has a problem with water insecurity, because Africa is a continent made up of 54 different countries. And if you actually look carefully, some countries are a lot smaller than we would normally see them on a map. Others are distorted and are a lot bigger. So it's only certain parts of the continent of Africa that suffer with this. And I want you to try and pick out which areas of the continent that might be if you're going to use Africa. The second area I would be drawn to is up there in the northeast in the top right of the map, and obviously the continent of Asia. But again, there's two countries which really stand out as being a lot bigger than I'd expect them to see, and therefore having a bigger issue with water insecurity. And the large green country at the top right of your map is not Russia. So do be careful. But to start off with, work out which countries they are, describe the pattern for me, trying to pick out continents, countries, examples, and regions of the world. The second thing we've got to do is then using some of the information which is going to come up on the slide in a minute. Now, going alongside this graphic information which we've given you, there's a bit of a description. So a paragraph there, and what I want you to do is to read through it. Take a few minutes, and it says in your booklet that I want you to note down 3 interesting facts. So look at the facts and figures, look at the statistics that are in that paragraph, and pick out the 3 which you think stand out the most. Maybe they're the most surprising. Maybe they're the most important. Maybe they're the statistics that sum up the problem or sum up the issue for you. But whatever they are, write them down. Just 3 facts and figures, and then we will be moving on. So that's our introduction to this topic. That is our pattern. We've got our locations. We know what sort of parts of the world we're looking at. And as I said before, we're generally going to be looking at the impacts in low-income countries and newly emerging economies today. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to be covering 4 different issues that we would be associating with water insecurity, 4 different things to show up some of the impacts of water insecurity on people and on communities. And for each of them, as I've said on the task sheet, there's some links to watch some videos just to give you some examples, give you a bit of a visualization of this. There's also some information from the textbook, which I've put into the PowerPoint for you. And all you need to do is read through that and fill in the 4 example boxes with the key findings from that. And I'm going to talk you through them now as we go through this video. So the first issue we're going to look at is we're going to be looking at waterborne disease and pollution. So obviously think about water insecurity, not having enough water. It can force people into drinking unsafe water because that's all they have available. And the River Ganges is our example we're going to be looking at here. So it runs through India and it also runs into Bangladesh. Mainly through India. It's a long river. It's relied on by millions and millions of people as a water source for bathing, for drinking, for feeding their animals, for cooking, for cleaning. And they've got 2 big issues of waterborne diseases in cholera and dysentery, and then a whole load of smaller issues with diseases like diarrhea as well. All important, but we're going to focus on the 2 of cholera and dysentery. And we need to think about why that is. Well, obviously, in the northern part of India, they rely heavily on meltwater from the Himalayan glaciers. That's what feeds the River Ganges. But they have unreliable rainfall at certain times of the year, so they do suffer from water insecurity. And then this main water supply, which they are relying on, is heavily polluted. And if you look at the raw facts, and this is what we need to start to write down in our example box, every single day there is around 1 billion litres of raw sewage pumped into the river from communities along the river. And that pretty much is a polite way of saying people are pooing into the river. And you can imagine the health problems that come from that for people that then are drinking that water, bathing in it, or cleaning with it, or cooking with it. There's then 260 million litres of untreated wastewater directly from factories being pumped into that river, again, every single day. And if you watch some of the videos, if you look at the examples they're talking about and read the information on the screen here, the main industry in that part of India that causes this pollution is the leather industry. It's the tanning, so the processing and the cleaning and the colouring of leather, which is causing those chemicals to be leaked and to be put into the river. So it's a massive problem, as we said. That's one small example which we're going to look at. You need to stop this, you need to watch those videos and then fill in that example box to describe what this problem is before we then move on to the second section. So our second issue we're going to look at is food production. And as it says on the slide there, agriculture, so farming for food, uses around 70% of global water supplies. And obviously, as I said earlier, we've got a growing population, 7.7 billion people and growing. We've got to have enough food, and most of that is going to come from farming, so from agriculture. And to produce that food, either watering the crops or feeding the animals, we need water. It's heavily reliant on water use. And in certain parts of the world, like in Egypt, we've got the River Nile as an example here. They are suffering again with water insecurity. It's a very dry region of the world, and there are many issues surrounding water insecurity. We're just going to focus on some of these to do with water shortages. So there's been some predictions, some projections made about the River Nile, and by the end of this century, by the year 2100, the River Nile is expected to be 90% smaller than it currently is. Now, if you're not sure what that would look like, imagine the current flow rate of the River Nile, and by the end of this century, only 10% of that water is still going to be flowing down the river. And that's mainly due to the irrigation, the over abstraction. So people on farms, people in cities and communities pumping and piping water through channels and pipes out of the river to use water in crops. So that's a big, big problem. And Egypt, as it is, already imports 60% of the food. So fast forward to the end of the century, they don't have enough water to grow the food they're currently growing or the food they need to grow to meet the demands of a growing population. So think about how that's going to have an even bigger impact on their economy as they need to import more food. Well, how are they going to find the money to do that if they're not able to grow the crops to sell to earn that money in the first place? So lots and lots of issues surrounding food production, which we've got there. Third issue we're going to look at is industrial output or industry. And as we mentioned last lesson, this is mostly an issue that affects low-income countries or newly emerging economies, but as they develop, as their economies are growing, these countries start to introduce and build factories. They widen their range of industries as they produce products and goods and refine goods. And as we said, these industries all are heavily reliant on water, either for the cooling of machinery or for the workers or involved in the production process itself. And we need to look at the country of China for our example. So China, the world's most populated country, almost 1.5 billion people. They have one of the largest economies in the world. They've got one of the largest industry sectors in the world. And by 2030, about 1/3 of China's total water use is going to be used in factories. And again, that's staggering considering they've got 1.4 billion people living in there. So we've got to think about how that's going to affect them. Now, in China, they've already had in the past issues of water shortages, and that has cost them $40 billion in lower industrial production. So because they've not had enough water, they've not been able to make the products, and that is the total amount of money that they've lost or they've not earned because they've not had the water to meet the demand. And some factories have had to close temporarily, some even completely, because of a lack of water. So big issues, a growing economy, an economy whose industrial sector is providing for the needs of many other countries around the world, and they're short of water. So a real problem. And then the fourth issue which we need to look at is water conflict. So conflict over water as a resource itself. Now, just thinking about where this is coming from, obviously not all rivers are just existing in one country. Take the River Nile, for example, flows through Egypt, but it also flows through 7 other countries before it reaches Egypt and then flows out into the Mediterranean Sea. The River Ganges, as I mentioned earlier, flows through India, but then it flows into Bangladesh before it then goes out into the ocean. So what is happening here? Well, some countries are building dams, either to control the flow of the water or to stop flooding, so it's a flood management scheme, or to generate power to help drive their industry. But the issue then arises over who owns the water. There then becomes a conflict over who has the right to use the water or to control how much water then flows into the future. And there's, as I said, there's not one clear example, but lots of little examples around the world. And if you follow the 2 links on here, you can start to look at some of those and look at the issues of conflict around those at present. Now, what you need to do is just read through the information on the 3rd page of this lesson in your booklet. I've given you a copy of this picture. I've also given you some information about India and Bangladesh and the River Ganges. And one short question for you to answer there. Why do upstream countries have an advantage in shared river basins? Well, hopefully the answer is quite simple. We know it's all about controlling the flow of water, so the quantity of water that flows downstream into the other countries, or the quality of that water, and then obviously that can lead to conflict. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the 4 issues or impacts of water insecurity, which we're going to look at for today's lesson. Now, all that's left for you to do then is to think about some of these impacts, and we're going to finish off by categorizing them into one of 4 sections. So social impacts, hopefully we understand what that word means. Social impacts are about the impacts on people. Economic impacts, impacts on the economy or the growth of the economy, so relating to money. Environmental impacts speak for itself. It's about the impacts or the effects on the natural environment. And then political. So conflicts would fall under a political impact. So what you need to do is take each of the different strands, the 8 strands from this spider diagram here, and work out which ones go into which section or which category of impacts they are. And we're going to keep coming back to this issue of water insecurity throughout the topic. We're going to keep revisiting some of these examples, and next lesson we're going to be starting to think about how we can improve the quality or quantity of water that's available in these low-income countries and newly emerging economies around the world where they currently have the issue of water insecurity.